Hey, I'm Dr. Terry Goodwin, and this is my introductory video for the Disciple Driven Church Training Center and Church Incubator. When I was younger, I attended many Christian Protestant churches. Some were affiliated with denominations and others were calling themselves non-denominational. But no matter where I went, they were very similar services. The music was different and how the pastor dressed was a little bit different, but they all had very similar service structures. So one thing they all had in common was the focus that they placed on the pastor's sermon. It was always center stage, and it was always the main part of the service. People would even say, "Oh, you should come and hear my pastor." There was just so much focus on the pastor and what the pastor did and what the pastor said during the service. As I got older, I felt a call to go into ministry full time. So I explored how that was done. And it led me to enroll in Bible college and seminary. See, that was the first step that was recommended to me by many of the professionals in the ministry. So as I worked my way through seminary, I realized that I was being trained to run an institutional church, not just to be the church, but to run this organization. So I shifted my focus to theology, and I began questioning our approach to how we do church. What I found was little to no biblical support for the things that were the main focus of most church services that I attended. It appeared that everything that was built into the design of those services originated somewhere other than in the Bible. And the fascinating thing to me was that they were all so similar, and yet what they were doing was not found in Scripture. So I asked an important question: whose instructions are we following? Well, most people never even consider this question. They go to church and assume it's correct, and I'm not sure why they don't ask the question. I'm not sure why I did, but maybe they all assume, as I did, that the leaders knew what they were doing, so therefore they must be right. If everybody's doing the same thing, it must be the way it's done, right? Maybe they assumed that it's always been that way, so it must be right. But whatever the reason, I want you to stop and I want you to consider that question. Walk into most church services in America next Sunday, and you're going to find striking similarities, no matter if it's Catholic or Protestant, if it's charismatic or not. No matter what their theological or denominational differences might be, they're all strikingly similar in the way that they operate their church services. They have a paid professional clergy leader. Some call them a priest, others call them a pastor. They have rows of seats facing a stage with a lectern or pulpit placed prominently somewhere on that stage. Someone is going to lead the singing. Often they're called a worship leader. Now, it may be a choir or a band or a single person, but somebody's leading music from the front. There's always a preset order to the service that they're following and outline. Each week, the same order is usually followed with very little variation, even though there may be some minor differences from one week to the next. Often, this involves announcements, scripture reading, singing, the sermon or message by the paid professional clergy, an opportunity to pay tithes or to give offerings, and then a closing prayer. So for most churches, the service always lasts for a similar period of time. Now, they're not all lasting the same, but from one church to the next, but for that church, then generally every week they're going to last the same amount of time. You can almost set your watch by it. And, even if you can't, you can at least make lunch reservations with confidence you're going to be able to make it to lunch. So it was astonishing to me that with so many differences in doctrine and tradition and leadership structures, that the weekly services are so similar. It's much less astonishing whenever you understand why they are so similar. Now, when you learn where these practices come from, you're going to understand why most churches share these similarities. The first assumption for many people is that, well, we all have the same Bible, so that could explain it. Well, if that's why they all have similar services, then why wouldn't they also agree on doctrine and theology and leadership structures, which they all disagree on? And while that could explain it, there's one small problem. Paid professional clergy leadership order of service, worship leaders, seats facing a stage where a sermon or a message is delivered, collecting of tithes. None of these are outlined in the New Testament. In fact, they all have their origins in another place that was common to all of today's modern churches and that share all these traits. That place was with the Roman Emperor Constantine. Constantine declared Christianity a legal religion with the Edict of Milan in 313 AD. He then began to implement sweeping changes to church structure, leadership, and services that remain in the church today. He didn't base these changes in the Bible. His changes reflected the pagan religions that already dominated the Roman Empire. His goal was to give Christianity the same structure as the dominant religions of his day. Constantine was trying to make Christianity credible in the eyes of the people. So he gave it tax-exempt status. He built its first public church. He designated paid clergy. He even convened councils to set doctrine and even instructed the leaders to list acceptable worship songs and outline an order of service. Sound familiar? Well, this new form of Christianity became eventually the Roman Catholic Church, and for over 1,000 years, that this form of church dominated the landscape. It wasn't until Martin Luther began the Protestant Reformation that the changes of Constantine faced any serious challenge or threat. But Martin Luther decided he was going to lead a reformation of theology, and he left most of Constantine's changes in place. He made minor changes to titles and called the priest a pastor, and some of the practices, such as letting the congregation partake in the cup during communion. But overall, the forms that Constantine implemented remained the same, even in the Protestant Reformation. So now we had the Catholic churches and an ever-increasing number of Protestant movements, all embracing the forms that Constantine had enacted. Well, the growing threat to Catholic theology from the new churches created the need for more professionally trained clergy that made doctrine even more dominant in the church than it was previously. So this led to the formation of seminaries to train priests. This occurred after the Council of Trent in the mid-1500s. As the Protestant churches moved to safer ground away from the center of power for the Catholic Church, they adopted the forms designed by Constantine and set up building-centered churches as well. Then they adopted this idea of seminary training, and they just adapted it to their theology and their needs. Today, it's nearly unheard of to think that we might hire or ordain a priest or pastor without seminary training. This is in spite of the fact that the Bible calls for no such training, and no one was formally seminary trained for over 1,000 years of the early church. Not that there wasn't training for priests, but the seminary form and system was just not there. So today, the path to full-time ministry runs through the seminary doors. I myself am seminary trained. I saw that as the only path to get to full-time ministry. So, the seminary of today focuses on training people to work in the institutional form of church that bears the design of Constantine. Most seminary training spends its time on things like doctrine and preaching and administration of the staff and building and counseling. There's very little training on making disciples and teaching those disciples to make disciples, or dealing with demons or spiritual warfare. And in short, if you want to follow the instructions of the Bible and have a church that follows God's design instead of Constantine's design, your modern seminary training is going to do you very little good. It did me very little good. So I want to change all that. So I've been studying and living the biblical instructions for the church and for my life for many years. And I've written and developed training in God's New Testament design for the church. And I'm now offering that training to anyone that's ready to leave Constantine's design for the church and embrace God's design for the church. So I'm announcing the start of the Disciple-Driven Church Training Center and Church Incubator, and it is a seminary alternative for ministry that trains people in New Testament church principles that are outlined in the Bible. We do not train in Constantine's methods for church design. There are 2 courses available. The first course consists of 12 classes. They can be taken from anywhere in the world as long as you have an internet connection. The course is written by and overseen by me, Dr. Terry M. Goodwin, and those completing this course will receive a certificate in New Testament Christianity and qualify to take the second course. Course number 2 is a 2-week on-location training held near St. Louis, Missouri, USA. Food, lodging, and course materials are provided at no charge. So those completing the course will receive a certificate in New Testament church leadership and be eligible to apply to become a missionary to America with Sun Ministries. Look, it's time that we get back to the Bible, because there's a coming reformation that's going to begin with a return to God's design for his church and a throwing off of Constantine's systems that were implemented almost 2,000 years ago. So if you feel called to minister and you want a seminary alternative, to learn more on the website, and you can apply today. Remember, Reformation is coming, and this opportunity is open to anybody in any part of the world. And I hope that we hear from you soon.